Our first live session this morning is Curtis Martin, who is the founder of the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, better known as Focus. And Curtis is going to speak with us about making missionary disciples. If you'd like to submit your questions, there will be a question and answer session after Curtis Martin's talk.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. As was mentioned, my theme is making missionary disciples, and I'd like to narrow in on two fundamental principles that I think will enlighten but also instruct us as to how we can be part of the solution and not just swept up with the problem. So the theme of making missionary disciples is going to flow from a book that I wrote a couple of years ago. And this is going to get into the how-to and what we can do. But I actually want to go one step deeper into the challenges that we're confronting and also the reality that we can walk our way out of this very simply. Not easily. These are going to require changes of habits and changes of behavior. So it's not easy, but it is simple. Each of us can do these two things that will address two of the fundamental problems that are undermining where we are. We are losing our culture. Headline news in every direction would show us that. We are losing our Christian identity, and we're losing our young people. And so I would like to talk about two fundamental facts that undergird or are failing to undergird these issues and how we, as faithful Catholics, can address them almost immediately to be able to have an impact. Let's just look real quickly at some stats. Since 1960, violent crimes have increased 560%, and illegitimate births were up 419%. This was 1990. It's gotten much worse. In 2005, 36.9% of all births were to unmarried women. There have been a tripling of the percentage of children living in single-parent homes, a quadrupling in divorce rates, a drop of almost 80 points in the SAT scores, and more than 200% increase in teenage suicide. Those pieces of data are somewhat old. Just this week, the CDC released information that for young people 18 to 24, this week it was released, 18 to 24, that 25% of our young people have considered suicide in the last 30 days. Why suicide? It's not because we're suffering. People suffer all over the world and would never think of killing themselves. We've lost the meaning and purpose in our lives. And when we suffer and have no meaning and purpose, we close the book. We end the story. And what I'd like to do is talk about two fundamental realities of how do we get our culture back. And I would argue that they're family and it's narrative. I want to take just a few moments on each of these issues, on family first, and then on narrative, or what I would call the meta-narrative, the big giant narrative, the meta-narrative that should shape our life, that for many generations has shaped our lives. And the good news is, if it's told well, can reshape our lives. But we live in a world without a coherent meta-narrative. Our young people don't know why they're alive, and so they're pursuing pleasure through drugs and illicit sexual activity, etc. And these activities, while they bring or may bring momentary pleasure, they bring long-lasting misery. It's a little bit, when you try to seek happiness outside of God's morality, it's a little bit like drinking salt water. At first, there may be some sense of addressing the thirst because there's fluid, but the salt in the water actually makes our situation much worse. In fact, if you continue to drink salt water, you'll lose your mind. And if you continue after that, it will kill you. So how do we train ourselves, our children, people within our culture to actually pursue authentic happiness through goodness so that they can actually make decisions that will feed their soul, that God can feed their soul through their activities, rather than something that undermines them? And I would take a look at the family first. We're going to look at the family and, again, the meta-narrative, but the family. And I'm going to reference Carl Zimmerman. We can put that slide up real quickly. Carl Zimmerman's book, Family and Civilization, 1947. Carl was a man who's not writing from a faith perspective, who studied families and civilization. He was a Harvard professor, a genius, recognized as the top person in his field. And he studied the effect of family structures and culture. And this is very, very important for us. Dr. Scott Hahn shared this with me many years ago when I was a grad student with him. And we have utilized this framework to teach our staff for 22 years within Focus. Because when we use the word family, we can mean many, many different things. And in fact, there's a redefinition of family that is undermining family as we know it in a powerful way. But even for many of us as faithful Catholics, as people who are pursuing God, men and women of goodwill, our understanding of family may be wildly impoverished because of the world that we live in, which whittles away our understanding of family. Zimmerman talks about this. And what I'd like to do is start with a little bit of a story. I realized that my wife and I have been implementing this vision, which I'm going to share with you in just a few seconds. We've been implementing it for years, and it was the framework from which we were living. And I had never shared the framework with my children. We had acted from the framework. And it hit me one night several years ago. My eldest son was at the dinner table with the rest of his siblings. We've been blessed with 9, and they were all there. And his fiance was there as well. And I realized my son is about to launch his own family. And he's free to do whatever he wants. But I'd like to propose truth and goodness and beauty to him with clarity so that he can choose to act, if he so chooses, in a way that would actually build what we're talking about. And so I shared what I'm about to share with you with them. And it was very interesting because my kids kind of sat back and listened. And at the very end of it, the conclusion was, Dad, thank you for sharing that, because for many reasons, we thought that we were just being raised Catholic Amish, if you will. We knew that we had been restricted in certain activities. You couldn't play violent video games. You couldn't go out and stay out as late as our friends. We had more rules and regulations. We knew the consequences, but we didn't have the vision. And here's the vision. Zimmerman said there's 3 types of families, essentially, writing from a sociological perspective and comparing it against history. When were cultures becoming great and when were they collapsing? He said the first type of family is what he called a trustee family. And in a trustee family, the family consists not only of mom and dad and their children, but also consists of grandma and grandpa. It consists also of the grandchildren and the great-grandparents. And then the trustee family is unique because it extends far beyond that. It doesn't just include the people you might know or might be alive when you are, but it includes all of your ancestors and all of those who will come after you. And to be able to recognize, I live as a trustee. My wife and I, as the head of our family, live as trustees. We've received the patrimony of Catholicism, of the family name, whatever it might be. And that's a gift. People born into poverty in various forms don't have all of the gifts. I was blessed to be raised by great Catholic parents, and they love one another, lived in an intact marriage, and lots of blessings, a middle-class home, and all of those things were good. Some people don't have them. But as a trustee, you receive and honor what's been given to you, and then your job is to build that and pass it on to future generations, many of whom you'll never meet this side of heaven, great-great-grandchildren. And so in the trustee family, parents would never think of abusing alcohol or getting a divorce because you would be impacting negatively the family trust. You would be there to invest and build and share. And Zimmerman said, when families live like this enriched notion of family, that cultures are born and they're strengthened. The second type of family is what he calls the nuclear family. Many of us know this. It's like the trustee family at a surface level, but different in a very dramatic way. This family consists of those you see and really ignores your ancestors who you've never met or your descendants who you'll never meet this side of heaven. And so you live for those you can see. You're not so concerned about those who've gone before you, and you're not at all concerned about those who might come after you. And the nuclear family, Zimmerman said, is always transitional. It lasts at best 2 generations. It's not an endurable thing. So either the families will move back to the trustee, or more frequently, they collapse into the third type of family, which is atomistic. The atomistic family is actually about the individual. It's all about me. I don't really care in any enduring way about my spouse, and therefore if they disappoint me, I will leave them. I'm not really concerned about my children. They're there to decorate my life. And so I will have them to the degree they make sense for my comfort and prestige, and to the degree they're too much work, I won't have them. He says in the atomistic family, through the generations, that divorce begins to multiply rapidly, that abortion and contraception begin to multiply radically, and all sorts of other social evils. And when culture is based upon atomistic families, they fall apart. And I think, brothers and sisters, that we can see that we live in a culture that has moved from the nuclear, the Ozzie and Harriet family of the 1950s, to the atomistic one, where young people today and people of all ages are living for themselves. And we shared this vision and said, we'd like to invite each of you, children, to join us in the great project of building the trustee family. That, yes, in part is the Martin family, but more than that, it's the Martin family's living out of the Catholic faith. The Catholic Church offers the greatest trustee family in the history of the world, stretching from Genesis to Jesus, into the church, into our modern lives, and well beyond our lives, into our descendants who we'll never meet. And we want to live in a way that takes the good and the true and the beautiful that's been passed on, purify it if necessary, build it, and then pass it on. I live for a brief amount of time in this great span of human history as the trustee of this great good. Families that live as trustees build. And to be able to see the power of this, to be able to see that we live in a world that doesn't at all live this way right now. Our culture is falling apart. And so we need to understand that when we use the term family, we should think about it in the way that the Catholic Church has always thought of it. That God is our Father, that we are one another's brothers and sisters, and that we have a great responsibility to not answer as Cain did, to say, am I my brother's keeper? Of course you are, and everybody else's keeper as well. My job is to live and lead through this life and to build for the future. That's the purpose of family. And we see young people today choosing to postpone or avoid marriage because they don't see the need to build for the future. They've chosen pets over children. Abortion is rampant. The hookup culture is replacing love and romance. And they've lost their way. And in the midst of that, when suffering is introduced to the world, well, they're tired, and so they just turn off the movie, the story, if you will, of their life, and are tempted towards suicide. And this explains it. I'd like to talk about the second piece. I could talk much more. We teach entire classes on Zimmerman's model, get into great detail. He gets into much more detail. If we had more time, it's a different talk. I want to talk about the meta-narrative, that we as Catholics have lived in a world where our meta-narrative has evaporated. That we have allowed the narrative that should shape our life to give us identity. That's the power of a meta-narrative. You begin to understand who you are in light of the story that is about your life. And so young people generations ago grew up with an understanding of what it meant to be Catholic, what it meant to be human, and what this life was all about, that this is a very important, very real life, but it's also temporary, that we are preparing, for better or for worse, for everlasting life. As St. John Newman said, everyone who ever lived still does somewhere. We are preparing for that life. Do you understand that? And not only am I preparing for eternal life, but am I helping everybody that I can to prepare for eternal life? Not to just get to heaven, as important as that is, the ultimate test of our lives, but to bring as many people with us as possible, which is why we're making missionary disciples. So what is the role of narrative in all of this? How do we play that out? Well, I would argue that we are experiencing a virus that defines our culture and our generation, and I'm not talking about COVID. That's hopefully a temporary blip, and it's part of the context, but it's not the fundamental narrative. I would argue the fundamental narrative is what's known on college campuses in philosophical terms as postmodernism. Postmodernism is the rejection of any narrative at all. There is nothing that makes sense out of life. Therefore, the only thing that's left is to pursue pleasure. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. In our culture, people of every generation, my focus has been primarily with young people, but all generations, the older, the younger, and the very young, are pursuing pleasure. Rather, for example, than going out and doing good and conquering evil in the real world, our young people spend hours a day conquering imaginary evil on video games in a virtual world, because the real world doesn't hold any meaning for them. You can't score points. And we need to recognize that we've allowed our young people and people of every age to go through what I would argue is a triple inoculation. We're hoping to get an immunization for COVID. And the experts right now are saying it's probably going to take multiple immunizations. And I would argue that we have immunized our people, particularly Catholics, against Catholicism, against the meta-narrative, in three powerful ways. First, Catholics have told our story very, very poorly. We've moved from a narrative-based approach to teaching the faith to principles, and then we taught the principles badly. Beginning in the 1960s and 70s, we only taught portions of the faith, typically the warm, fuzzy pieces, and not the hard edges. And we bored our young people out of the faith. We didn't tell them. We have the best story ever. Think about some of the best Hollywood movies ever written, the greatest story ever told, The Passion of the Christ, The Ten Commandments. Our stories are amazing. We just don't tell them. And so they sit in the background. And then we don't teach the principles well. And that's the first inoculation. The second one is scientism. We've allowed science to grow up, and I'm pro-science in a big way, and I'm thankful. I know Father Spitzer is probably listening. Thank you for your great work in reconciling these. Science is amazing, but it's one way of knowing truth. Faith and revelation is another way of knowing truth, and science is kind of going through an adolescence where it's rejecting other forms of wisdom. And so scientism has rejected the historical reliability of salvation history, that we don't believe our story. I've heard theologians actually in theology classes taught at Catholic universities question whether or not King David ever existed. And even though there are portions of science like archaeology that are frequently and reoccurringly supporting the fact that what the scriptures say historically are in fact true, there's a fundamental sense in most young people that at best Christianity, Judeo-Christianity is a myth, and it might even be a good myth. So we've taught that badly, and science has come in and said we've got all the answers. And science has many answers, but they don't have the answers to even the most important questions. Why are you here? Where are you going? What is the meaning of life? Science can't even offer an answer for those. Why is there anything rather than nothing? Science can't do that. Once you acknowledge there are things, you can measure them and you can study them, and there's great wisdom there. But to overstate the truth claims of science is to understate the truth claims of faith and philosophy. And we have to recognize they're supposed to hold in tension and support one another, and we live in a culture that has not. The third form is bad narratives. As we've failed to tell our narrative, the great story of salvation, the great story of the Old Testament patriarchs and matriarchs, the great stories of the saints, we've allowed other people to tell stories that don't have the same meaning and purpose. The stories that have impacted our young people's lives in the vacuum, no salvation history, no great stories of the saints, and if they are, they're only fables that aren't true, not grounded in history. And so we've told other stories. The stories that have shaped our young people's lives started more benign, Star Wars, but it's a meta-narrative. It's not just a little story, it's lots and lots of stories. Moved on, and we would sit back and say Harry Potter, and listen to the author of Harry Potter as she states her theme for the books. Quote, J.K. Rowling, as I look back over the 5 published books, I realize that it's a kind of litany of bad fathers. That's where evil seems to flourish, in places where people didn't get good fathering. This stands in stark contrast to salvation history, which maybe is encapsulated more perfectly in the prodigal son than any other parable, in which we hear the truth claim of Judeo-Christianity that God is a good father. It's I'm not against Harry Potter if you've got the framework of salvation history to compare it and contrast it to, but when it fills the vacuum that's left when salvation history isn't taught, you're left with a narrative that actually is about bad fathering. Or Game of Thrones, the most watched TV in all of creation. And according to George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones, the narrative, this is a narrative where nothing is certain. Goodness is not rewarded and evil is not punished. The outcomes are intentionally haphazard with no meaning or purpose. And that's the meta-narrative that our young people, without ever taking a class, have absorbed. Nothing I do, no good I do is rewarded, no evil I do is punished. It doesn't matter. It's all about power. It's all about pleasure. And so they pursue. And rather than building a kingdom like a trustee family would, they live in a tiny kingdom where they're the only king. I'm reminded of St. Thomas More to Richie Rich, when Richie Rich betrayed Thomas More and was given the lordship of Wales. And Thomas looked at him and said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? The whole world. But Wales? These are people who live in a tiny, tiny little story in which they're the central figure. Whereas Judeo-Christianity, Catholicism, calls us to live in the greatest story ever told, and we're never going to be the central character. Jesus Christ is the center of human history. But each of us in our generation are given the opportunity to be a leading character in support, to be the best supporting actor or actress that we possibly can be. Listen to Archbishop Chaput describe this recently at Notre Dame. The future belongs to people who believe in something beyond themselves, who live and sacrifice accordingly. It belongs to people who think intergenerationally. If you want a portrait of what I mean, consider this. The most common name given to newborn male babies in London for the past 4 years is now Muhammad. This is the city of Thomas More. We have not told a story that is compelling and captures the imagination. So we'd say, I want to name my kids after them. We need to build a culture based upon narrative, and the best place to tell the narratives is within the family. If you want to build a trustee family, fathers and mothers should become great storytellers. And you don't make them up. You tell the stories that are based and grounded in history, the great stories of the patriarchs, the great stories of the saints, the great stories of salvation history, to be able to recognize that we've got the greatest story ever. This is not incidental to our cultural crisis. Our first president in his farewell address said this: of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain, that man would claim tribute to patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. These firmest props are of the duties of men as citizens. And let us with caution indulge the suppositions that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on the minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in the exclusion of a religious principle. We need to understand that the key is to center in on our families, to become a place where stories are told, where not any story, but the true stories of salvation history and of the saints. When we do that, we will not get into arguments with our family members. We will captivate their imagination with the great stories. As Tolkien said to C.S. Lewis, and it led to Lewis's conversion, salvation history is the true myth. All of the captivating stories of any myth, grounded in the reality of history. I invite you to join with me prayerfully to center on our families and allow our families to be places where stories are told so that the meta-narrative can be built and people will realize why they're here and where we're going. In doing so, we will begin making missionary disciples. Thank you. I think we're able to take some questions.
Curtis, thank you for a really powerful presentation this morning, and happy feast day of Our Lady's Assumption into heaven, the mother of a great family there, right? So we can honor her today. So a question for you, Curtis.
The 33rd anniversary of my wife and mine's first date, right after Mass on this great day.
Congratulations. Much of your work, Curtis, has been in rebuilding this culture of narrative and trying to recapture the spirit of missionary discipleship amongst a very particular demographic, university-age students. Why do you think, or why have you thought, how have you found that particular demographic to be a key place in this project of rebuilding the kind of family culture that is so essential to our, not just our Catholic identity, but to our national identity too? Why that demographic, and what have you found in your work there?
Great question. I would argue that the university is not more important. Everything is important. Battling for the unborn. You could spend the rest of your life, and hopefully many of you are, battling to support marriage, battling to get rid of pornography, battling to address poverty in its many forms, or slavery. There are more slaves on earth than ever in history. You could take any of these pieces, and everything in our culture needs to be fixed. But if you have to fix everything, where do you start? And I would argue the college campus is where, because you're going to reach young leaders gathered by the tens of thousands at the very beginning of their adult lives. And if their hearts are captivated by Jesus Christ, by the great meta-narrative that is Catholicism, if they're captivated by that, they'll live the rest of their lives with impact, and they'll go become the moms and dads and priests and religious. They'll become that next generation of those who will battle in favor of life and in favor of marriage and against abortion and against slavery. And so it's the most pivotal place. And I'll add to that because it's a great question, but I want to cite Christian Smith's book, Religious Parenting, in which he said, the one fundamental habit that when parents live leads to the next generation of Catholics practicing their faith, religious parenting, the one habit more than any other, they have spiritual stories that are shared. That's the narrative. Tell the great stories of Saint Therese, but also of Moses. And when we do that, we capture their imagination, and with imagination, they can live the rest of their lives and be led by God wherever they're supposed to go, because everything needs to be.
Great. Thanks, Curtis. I want to circle back for a moment. You mentioned just briefly how scientism is one of those contributing factors to losing the narrative. We've lost the narrative through this predominance of scientism, which is, of course, as you said, science need not be to the exclusion of faith, but in fact, academically speaking, and in the formation of the young people, it has become that to the exclusion of faith. We had a question come in from a man named Gregory, who mentioned how it seems to him that the postmodernism, which is underpinning the real decline of the family culture, that postmodernism, because it casts out all narrative, the role of narrative at all. Gregory wonders, well, isn't that precisely the fruit of the kind of bad science, the scientism, which makes people think that faith has no place? So he's asking about, well, if we live in a postmodern culture, which is rooted in, let's say, evolutionary theory, what's to be done to recuperate that in this current academic climate that is so much marked by that factor?
That's a great question. It is one of the causes. I would say that the others, the poor teaching of the Catholic people to their next generation, sets the framework. Scientism, and then I would argue postmodernism, which says there are no narratives, don't trust anybody, any truth claims at all. They go together. And let's be honest, I'm not here to critique Darwin's theory as it pertains to science. That's the work of scientists, and there are truth kernels in there. But please be sure, if you read Darwin was trying to create a creation myth, a creation account for postmodernism, for a world without God. And that is a purpose it has served, and that's where it's evil, to be able to recognize this. What we need to do is replace myths, they can be benign or they can be harmful, with true myth or true story. You think about St. Augustine, back in his lifetime in the 300s, he has a deacon write to him and says, my catechism students are bored, what should I do? And he essentially says, tell them stories. Because when you tell people stories, they lean in. And his book, Catechesis Rudibus, is a testimony to the importance of storytelling in catechesis. I would argue that his book, The City of God, is the great story of humanity from beginning of time to end. And his great book, The Confessions, is his story. All Augustine did was become the best storyteller and the most influential Christian thinker for 1,000 years. In fact, he's quoted more than any saint in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and he's the great storyteller. And so stories are the antidote to postmodernism, including scientism, which finally leaves us with facts somewhat hollow because it doesn't lead to meaning.
Thanks, Curtis. I'm so glad you mentioned St. Augustine. St. Augustine is such a giant of the 4th century there. And it occurs to me that, in addition to his emphasis on telling true stories and his own story, what was so essential to his project in his culture of making missionary disciples of the 4th century was friendship. So I know that that's a key part of focus and the work that you all do on college campuses, university campuses. And of course, in this world, in the pandemic world that we live in, where people are so disconnected, we see the wicked fruit, the ill fruit of people not being able to engage in friendship. Could you say something about friendship and how that is part of this project of making missionary disciples?
Well, thank you. And it's vitally important. I think we have to understand that friendship is the center of reality. What we're told theologically is that there is a God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they live in infinitely perfect friendship from all of eternity past, in the present, and all eternity future. It is friendship. It is the source of our creation. It's also the commandment. God says, love God, be in friendship with God, and love neighbor, be in friendship with others. And really, the training ground for friendship ought to be our families, to be able to recognize this is the school of friendship. But you walk into a college campus meal hall today, and 20 years ago, we would sit down and start talking to students, and it was a little awkward to insert yourself into a conversation. But today you sit down and everybody's got earbuds in and nobody's actually having lunch together. They're just eating near one another. To be able to break into that and recognize friendship is essential to our salvation. It's also essential to be able to recognize the power of making missionary disciples. And this is not new. This is what Jesus did. We like to say within Focus, how did Jesus save the world? He found 12 men and went camping for 3 years. I mean, it's a wild story. Even Augustine himself had a shortage of priests. And I'm not telling the bishops what to do, but this is what he did. He could have sent his priests all over the diocese and because there was great need. Instead, he gathered them and made them live with him. And he shared meals with them and then sent them out. But at the meals, they shared stories. And he captivated their imagination, and they took that imagination and went out and captivated others. This is how St. Paul shares the faith over and over again in the book of Acts. They'll say, why are you on trial today? And he'll say, well, let me tell you the story. I was on my way to Damascus, and he tells his conversion story. Story is powerful because even in a postmodernist world that I won't believe any truth claim you make, I will still listen to stories, even bad ones like Game of Thrones, to be able to sit back because the narrative still captures our imagination. And we need to win the hearts, and that's done within friendship, and it's done with the tool of narrative and meta-narrative. I will add just before we conclude,
yes,
that authentic friendship is one of the 3 most critical factors we've found in our missionaries. That they would live in divine intimacy is the first, living a sacramental life and a life of prayer. The second one is that they would live in authentic friendship. And the third one is they would understand the need to be on mission and to go out and raise up missionary disciples. Those 3 habits, when lived well, have led to Focus's explosive growth. And when they're not lived well, we fail. And I would argue the church doesn't do these 3 things effectively right now in our culture. And we can, and we ought.
One last question, Curtis, before we conclude, maybe to just bring this home for the kind folks who are watching and listening this morning, most of whom are not probably college or university aged, but who know many people in their families who are, or some who are. Do you have any advice for our Napa Institute family here who might be worried about their children or grandchildren? They see them drifting into being gobbled up by the evils of this age. Do you have any advice for where to begin to reclaim some of this spirit of the gospel?
At the dinner table. The family meal is an important place. From the beginning of time, if we go back into Genesis, you'll find that Abraham was selected by God because he had the heart of a father as a patriarch and would tell the stories to his children. This is the fundamental reality. Don't sit at the dinner table and allow your dinner table to be a place of polemics and arguments. You will make your children not want to eat with you. Rather, tell stories that have captivated your imagination and share that. It's going to take practice, but this is not difficult. This is something each of us can learn to do. We're meant to do. And when we do, it breathes life back into our families. We need to recognize, I was going to bring up a quote. We could put it up. I'm not going to quote it. But Peter Kraft essentially said, after being a university professor for essentially 30 years, that the young people today, the Catholics he teaches at a Catholic college, do not know how to go to heaven. And we have to recognize we need to teach our young people that heaven is all that matters. You could be poor and miserable in this life and die and go to heaven and you win. And any amount of success in this life followed by hell is catastrophic failure. This is all that matters. But we can add, and you're more likely to get there and you'll enjoy it better if you bring as many people with you as possible. And the great stories of salvation history show this over and over and over again. The captivating figures of St. Francis and St. Clare and St. Ignatius of Loyola and Ignatius of Antioch. But to be able to tell these stories, and then the great part of the meta-narratives, you link them all together. Every Catholic I've ever met knows that Moses parted the Red Sea and that David killed Goliath. They don't know which one happened first or how they fit together. And the great power of the meta-narrative, it links all of the true little stories into the massive story that says there is a God who is infinitely good and perfect. and he loves you, and that love is insurmountable. He spends all of creation in pursuit of us after the fall. And he reaches that definitive solution in Jesus, and it's our job to then live that definitive solution out in our lives. That's a story that I've watched hundreds of thousands of young people lean into and say, tell me more, and then teach me how to tell others. I really appreciate the Napa Institute and the opportunity to be with you. Thank you for your questions and for your time.
God bless you. Thank you, Curtis, and happy feast day. And let's pray for each other that we all get to heaven. God bless you.